Before European powers ever set foot on its soil, Africa was a land of astonishing diversity and brilliance. Vast kingdoms thrived across deserts, jungles, and savannas. Great trade networks connected distant cities, carrying gold, salt, ivory, and knowledge across the continent. Empires rose and fell, leaving behind monumental architecture, complex political systems, and rich cultural traditions. Cities like Timbuktu shone as centers of learning, where scholars debated philosophy, science, and art. From the bustling markets of West Africa to the majestic palaces of Ethiopia, Africa was a continent alive with innovation, governance, and human ingenuity. Yet, this vibrant tapestry of civilizations was about to face a challenge that would reshape the entire continent. In the late 19th century, European nations, driven by ambition and industrial hunger, began to turn their eyes toward Africa. It was not curiosity or admiration that brought them, it was the desire for resources, land, and power. Africa's rivers, forests, and minerals were seen not as part of thriving societies but as commodities to be claimed, controlled, and exploited. Imagine a continent where empires such as the Ashanti, Zulu, and Ethiopian empires had flourished for centuries, where leaders exercised diplomacy, strategy, and governance, suddenly facing foreign powers that intended to redraw borders and seize control without any consent. The irony is profound. The very people whose lands and lives were being divided and catalogued had no voice in the decisions that would dictate their futures. In this video, we will uncover the story of Africa before colonization, explore how its societies functioned, and set the stage for the dramatic events of the Berlin Conference. We will also highlight the resilience of African peoples, who, even in the face of overwhelming foreign pressure, fought to preserve their cultures, identities, and autonomy. This is a story not just of conquest, but of courage, creativity, and unbroken spirit. By understanding Africa's rich pre-colonial history, we gain perspective on the continent's enduring strength and the origins of the challenges and triumphs we see today. Join us as we journey through time, uncover forgotten kingdoms, and meet leaders whose wisdom and bravery shaped generations. If this story sparks your curiosity and inspires you to learn more about Africa's past, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an exploration into the untold histories that have shaped our world. Together, let us reclaim these stories and celebrate the incredible legacy of Africa. By the late 19th century, Africa's rich landscapes, teeming with life and history, had attracted the attention of European empires whose ambitions extended far beyond exploration and curiosity. These powers, fueled by industrial revolutions that demanded ever-increasing quantities of rubber, gold, ivory, and other valuable resources, saw the continent not as a collection of thriving societies but as an open ledger waiting to be claimed, catalogued, and exploited. The grandeur of African kingdoms, the palaces of Ethiopia, the bustling trade cities of West Africa, and the well-organized military states of the Zulu and Ashanti was overlooked in the corridors of European diplomacy. Instead, Africa's rivers, forests, and fertile lands were measured in terms of profit, potential, and strategic advantage, disregarding the civilizations that had cultivated them for centuries. In the winter of 1884, in a stately building in Berlin, a gathering took place that would forever alter the course of African history. 14 European nations, joined by representatives from the United States, convened at the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Their agenda was pragmatic for Europe: to prevent conflicts among themselves over African territories while ensuring that no single power dominated the continent. However, what these men did not consider, or perhaps did not care to consider, was the perspective of those who had lived, ruled, and thrived on these lands for generations. Not a single African leader was present in that room, no king or chief, no elder or representative from the many states and communities that spanned the continent. The decisions made on that day, over discussions of maps, treaties, and lines drawn in ink, ignored the voices of those who would bear the consequences, leaving an entire continent's future in the hands of strangers who understood little of its complexity and even less of its people. The negotiations were meticulous in their European terms, but utterly blind to African realities. Borders were drawn with rulers and quills, slicing through communities, cultures, and kingdoms as if they were mere pages on a map, detached from the lives that depended upon them. The Ashanti lands, rich in gold and strategically located, were parcelled in ways that disregarded centuries of governance and alliances. The Congo, a vast and resource-rich territory, was handed over to King Leopold I of Belgium, not for his country, but as a personal fiefdom. France claimed vast stretches of West Africa. Britain expanded into East and Southern Africa. And Germany, a newcomer to the imperial game, took smaller but strategically significant portions. Each claim was justified under the guise of order and civilization. Yet in reality, these divisions were drawn to maximize European advantage, often cutting through rivers, mountain ranges, and trading routes that had naturally connected communities for generations. What made this appropriation so devastating was the complete erasure of local governance from the equation. African kingdoms that had maintained intricate systems of justice, trade, and diplomacy were suddenly confronted with foreign authorities who imposed new legal codes, economic systems, and administrative structures without consent or collaboration. Traditional rulers were bypassed, co-opted, or outright dismissed, and communities were forced to navigate new borders that often placed former allies under different colonial powers or divided kinship networks. The psychological impact of this, combined with the material exploitation that soon followed, disrupted social cohesion and sowed confusion across vast regions. Yet, even as maps were redrawn in Berlin, the African continent was not passive. The imposition of borders and the arrival of colonial administrators sparked a range of responses, from diplomacy and negotiation to armed resistance. Leaders like Emperor Menelik I in Ethiopia scrutinized the treaties presented by the Europeans, identifying discrepancies and loopholes, and preparing his army for the confrontation that would culminate in the historic victory at Adwa. In West Africa, rulers like Samurai T adapted strategies of trade, diplomacy, and guerrilla warfare to defend their people's autonomy, showing remarkable ingenuity in the face of foreign encroachment. Even in regions where formal armies were absent, resistance manifested in subtle but powerful ways. Communities maintained their cultural practices, continued traditional education, and preserved oral histories that the colonial powers sought to erase. The Berlin Conference, often portrayed as a diplomatic success in European histories, thus becomes a story of profound injustice when seen from the perspective of the continent itself. It demonstrates how political power and technological advantage enabled a small group of foreign actors to impose decisions that affected millions, disregarding centuries of social, economic, and cultural development. Borders drawn in conference rooms became instruments of control, facilitating resource extraction, labor exploitation, and cultural suppression. Yet the same borders could not erase memory, knowledge, or the enduring spirit of African communities who adapted, resisted, and persisted despite these impositions. In the aftermath, the consequences of these decisions were immediate and far-reaching. European nations established administrations, deployed military forces, and began systematic resource extraction, often using violent methods to enforce compliance. Communities were fragmented, trade networks redirected, and traditional governance structures undermined. Still, even in the face of such overwhelming change, the resilience of African societies shone through. Secret schools taught indigenous knowledge alongside colonial curricula. Poets and storytellers preserved the histories of kingdoms. And ordinary people found ways to resist cultural erasure while navigating the imposed structures of colonial rule. The story of how European powers divided Africa without consulting its leaders is a crucial lens through which to understand both the historical and modern challenges facing the continent. It is a story of ambition and greed, but also of resilience, ingenuity, and the unbroken thread of African identity. The borders drawn in Berlin were never merely lines on a map, they were catalysts for struggle, negotiation, and adaptation, shaping the continent in ways that continue to resonate over a century later, reminding us that history is not only defined by those who hold power, but also by those who endure, resist, and reclaim their own narratives. By the mid-19th century, Europe had entered a period of intense industrial growth, a time when factories belched smoke and engines roared with newfound power, demanding ever greater supplies of raw materials to feed their machines and expand their economies. It was in this climate of ambition and technological acceleration that Africa, a continent vast and richly endowed with natural resources, caught the attention of European powers. The forests, rivers, and mineral-rich soils of Africa were no longer seen merely as distant lands of mystery and beauty, but as repositories of wealth waiting to be extracted and transported across the globe. Rubber, with its elasticity and industrial applications, became a highly coveted resource, fueling the growth of industries from transportation to manufacturing. Gold, the ultimate symbol of both wealth and power, drew explorers and traders to dig deep into the heart of the continent, often with little regard for the communities whose lands were disturbed. Ivory, prized for its beauty and rarity, was removed from forests at unsustainable rates, feeding European demand for decorative art, piano keys, and jewelry. Cocoa, cotton, and other cash crops were cultivated extensively, not to sustain African populations, but to satisfy European markets hungry for exotic commodities and luxury goods. These economic ambitions were inseparable from the political strategies of empire. European nations, seeking not only material wealth but also geopolitical advantage, viewed African territories as chess pieces in a game of continental influence and global prestige. Colonization became a means to secure trade routes, establish ports, and project power far beyond Europe's borders, ensuring that rivals could not claim lands of strategic importance. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 formalized these ambitions, turning Africa into a map of claims and concessions where treaties and lines on paper dictated the fate of millions, often without the slightest understanding of local cultures, economies, or political systems. Leaders in Berlin measured the continent not by the value of its human capital or the complexity of its societies, but by the potential profit that could be extracted from forests, rivers, and mines, envisioning railways and ports that served imperial ambitions rather than local development. The consequences of this resource-driven colonization were immediate and often devastating. In the Congo, under King Leopold, vast areas of rainforest were converted into rubber plantations where forced labor, brutal quotas, and violent punishment became the norm. The extraction of rubber was not simply an economic activity, it became a mechanism of terror, a way to control populations and instill fear while ensuring a steady flow of wealth to European hands. Millions of people suffered, their communities disrupted, their lives and health sacrificed for distant profits. In South Africa, The discovery of diamonds and gold prompted a rush of European settlers and entrepreneurs who established mines that enriched imperial economies while local laborers endured harsh conditions. Long hours and minimal compensation. The wealth extracted from African soil rarely remained on the continent. It flowed outward, building empires, financing industrial expansion, and enriching coffers thousands of miles away while leaving local societies impoverished, fractured, and dependent on colonial systems. Yet, even as Africa was being systematically plundered, its people did not surrender passively. The very desire of Europeans to control resources created opportunities for resistance, adaptation, and strategy. Leaders and communities across the continent recognized that survival depended not only on courage in battle but on ingenuity and foresight. In West Africa, rulers like Semi used trade, diplomacy, and guerrilla tactics to protect their territories and maintain a degree of autonomy despite European encroachment. In the Ashanti Kingdom, Queen Nyerazantiwa organized defenses and coordinated efforts to safeguard the gold-rich lands under her control, asserting authority and protecting cultural integrity in the face of external pressures. Even in regions where open warfare was not possible, resistance took subtler forms. Farmers, traders, and artisans found ways to disrupt colonial exploitation, preserve traditional knowledge, and ensure that communities retained a sense of identity and continuity despite the extraction of their resources. Colonial strategies to secure these resources were rarely simple acts of occupation. They often combined force with manipulation, coercion, and economic dependency. Taxes were imposed on populations not to build infrastructure for local benefit, but to compel Africans to participate in labor systems that served European profit. Railways, ports, and roads were constructed primarily to transport minerals, crops, and raw materials to markets abroad rather than to connect African communities or facilitate local commerce. European administrators and companies structured economies so that control over resources translated directly into control over populations, ensuring that those who lived on the land were dependent on systems that enriched outsiders. The cultivation of cocoa in Ghana, the mining of diamonds in South Africa, and the logging of forests for rubber in the Congo became symbols of both exploitation and the imposition of foreign economic priorities, illustrating how the drive for natural wealth reshaped entire regions. Despite the overwhelming scale of these efforts, the pursuit of resources also inspired creativity and endurance among African societies. Communities adapted their agricultural practices, preserved cultural knowledge, and found ways to educate their youth, even under the constraints imposed by colonial authorities. Stories, songs, and oral histories became tools of resistance, embedding lessons about survival, resilience, and self-determination. African leaders demonstrated that while European powers could control land and extract wealth, they could not fully dominate spirit, memory, or identity. Resistance, whether through negotiation, rebellion, or preservation of tradition, became a critical counterbalance to the forces seeking to turn Africa's riches into instruments of foreign power. In examining the scramble for Africa through the lens of natural resource extraction, it becomes clear that European colonization was not motivated by altruism, curiosity, or a desire to civilize, as imperial rhetoric often claimed, but by a calculated effort to harness Africa's immense wealth for industrial and political gain. The forests, rivers, mines, and fertile lands were commodities in a global economy, their value measured by how effectively they could serve the ambitions of empires. Yet the history of this period is not only one of exploitation, it is also a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unbroken determination of African societies to protect their lands, communities, and identities in the face of overwhelming external pressure. reminding us that wealth and resources alone do not determine the strength of a civilization, but that spirit, leadership, and ingenuity endure even when faced with the forces of empire. Amid the wave of European colonization that swept across Africa in the late 19th century, few episodes illustrate the cruelty and exploitation of imperial ambitions more vividly than the story of King Leopold I's Congo Free State. Unlike other colonial possessions, which were claimed on behalf of European nations, the Congo was declared the personal property of Leopold, a king driven by a voracious appetite for wealth and prestige. From the moment he assumed control, the Congo became a vast experiment in extraction, bureaucracy, and terror, a place where human lives were subordinated entirely to the demands of profit. The lush forests and winding rivers that had nurtured generations of communities were transformed into instruments of exploitation, their natural bounty harvested to fuel the king's insatiable desire for rubber and ivory, commodities in unprecedented demand across Europe. What made the Congo Free State particularly horrifying was not merely the extraction of resources, but the methods used to enforce compliance. Villagers were compelled to meet quotas for rubber collection that were often impossible to achieve. Failure to produce the required amounts was met with brutal punishment, and reports from the period recount entire villages being decimated as warnings to others. Hands were severed, not only as punishment but as symbolic proof of submission, and those who resisted or failed to comply faced beatings, imprisonment, or death. The scale of suffering was immense. Contemporary estimates suggest that millions perished under these conditions, a staggering human cost that left scars on communities for generations. The methods employed by Leopold's agents were designed not only to extract wealth efficiently, but to instill fear, ensuring that the population would be too terrorized to resist while maximizing profits for the king thousands of miles away in Brussels. The administration of the Congo Free State was carefully structured to maintain this system of domination. Agents, often armed with firearms and backed by mercenary forces, patrolled the interior, enforcing rules with ruthless efficiency. Villages were catalogued and monitored, and local leaders were coerced into participating in the collection system, their traditional authority undermined or manipulated to serve foreign interests. European oversight was minimal in the field, but the bureaucratic machinery in Leopold's government ensured that rubber and ivory flowed steadily to international markets. Letters, reports, and photographs sent back to Europe painted a sanitized picture for the public, often highlighting progress and civilization while concealing the extreme violence and suffering that underpinned the production of these commodities. Despite the scale of terror, resistance persisted across the Congo. Some communities fled into remote forests to escape forced labor. Others engaged in acts of defiance, refusing quotas or sabotaging tools and resources to slow production. Oral histories passed down in Congolese families recount the courage of those who, in the face of impossible oppression, preserved a sense of dignity and identity, even under conditions designed to erase cultural continuity. Traditions, stories, and spiritual practices endured, quietly defying the attempts to convert the entire landscape into a machine of extraction. This resistance, often understated in European accounts, represents a testament to the resilience of human spirit in the face of overwhelming exploitation. The Congo Free State also highlights the interconnectedness of European greed and industrial demand. Rubber, harvested under coercion, fed the tires of bicycles and the engines of automobiles, while ivory adorned European homes and offices as symbols of prestige. The profits generated were vast, creating wealth for Leopold and investors, but leaving behind a trail of social destruction that would shape the Congo for decades to come. Entire populations were displaced, agricultural systems disrupted, and communities left to grapple with the consequences of labor that was imposed under threat of violence. European narratives of civilizing missions concealed these realities, framing the Congo's exploitation as progress while silencing the voices of those who bore its human cost. The story of the Congo Free State is inseparable from the broader patterns of the scramble for Africa. While European powers claimed lands across the continent, the Congo represents a particularly stark example of what happens when colonial ambition is divorced from accountability or moral restraint. It is a chapter in which the thirst for natural resources, rubber, ivory, and minerals was prioritized above human life, and where the mechanisms of empire created a system that could extract wealth at unimaginable human cost. Yet even in this darkest period, the resilience of the Congolese people endured. Communities found ways to preserve culture, memory, and identity, and the tales of bravery and defiance eventually fueled international outrage, leading to reforms and the eventual transfer of control away from Leopold, though the legacy of violence persisted. Reflecting on the Congo Free State allows us to understand how European economic ambitions shaped not only territorial boundaries but human lives. The extraction of resources was not a neutral act. It was enforced through violence, coercion, and psychological domination. The Congo's forests and rivers, once home to vibrant societies, became sites of terror. Yet the courage, endurance, and ingenuity of the people ensured that Africa's story was not entirely written by its oppressors. It is a story that connects directly to the broader scramble for Africa, illustrating how greed, unchecked power, and industrial demand could devastate entire regions, while simultaneously highlighting the unyielding spirit of those who resisted, preserved, and ultimately reclaimed their history in the centuries that followed. Even as European powers swept across Africa, imposing borders, extracting resources, and restructuring societies to serve foreign ambitions, the continent's people did not succumb quietly to this encroachment. Resistance took many forms, reflecting the diversity, ingenuity, and resilience of African communities and their leaders. From formal armies to local militias, from scholars to mothers passing down oral histories, Africans employed every means available to defend their lands, their cultures, and their sovereignty. The Battle of Adwa in 1896 stands as one of the most remarkable examples, where Emperor Meleki of Ethiopia, anticipating European designs on his territory, skillfully prepared his army, analyzed treaties, and leveraged the geography of his homeland to repel the invading Italian forces. This victory not only preserved Ethiopian independence but also became a powerful symbol across Africa, demonstrating that European technological and military superiority was not insurmountable when met with strategy, unity, and deep knowledge of the land. Beyond such headline battles, resistance thrived in subtler, persistent forms. In West Africa, rulers like Samurai waged protracted campaigns to safeguard their territories against French expansion, blending diplomacy, trade negotiations, and guerrilla tactics to frustrate colonial ambitions. These leaders understood that survival required more than a single confrontation. It demanded sustained effort, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of both European strategies and local terrain. Communities across the continent adopted similar approaches, refusing to allow foreign domination to dictate every aspect of their lives. They preserved cultural practices, languages, and traditional governance systems, ensuring that even in the shadow of colonial administration, African identity remained vibrant. In many regions, secret schools and clandestine gatherings became essential spaces where knowledge of heritage, spiritual traditions, and history could be passed on to the next generation, often in direct defiance of colonial authorities who sought to impose European education and erase indigenous practices. The story of resistance also reveals the remarkable role of African women, who often led both military and cultural struggles. Figures like Yazantiwa of the Ashanti Kingdom mobilized entire communities to defend honor, territory, and cultural symbols against British encroachment. Her declaration, "If the men will not fight, I will," encapsulates the determination that characterized much of Africa's defiance, highlighting that leadership and courage were not confined to gender or status, but emerged wherever the stakes demanded extraordinary resolve. Women engaged in organizing supplies, relaying intelligence, and maintaining morale, demonstrating that the struggle for autonomy was a collective effort encompassing every member of society. Even when armed confrontation was impossible or undesirable, Africans found ways to resist through economy, culture, and daily life. Farmers sometimes withheld crops or diverted labor away from colonial enterprises, undermining exploitive systems without engaging in direct combat. Poets, storytellers, and musicians embedded narratives of resistance into songs and oral histories, ensuring that the memory of defiance, heroes, and victories endured. Religion and spirituality provided a framework for hope and moral authority, reinforcing communal bonds and offering a subtle counterpoint to imposed colonial ideologies. These forms of nonviolent resistance were critical because they preserved cultural continuity and nurtured the identity that colonizers sought to erase, laying the foundation for future movements of liberation and self-determination. The geographical diversity of Africa also shaped the methods of resistance. In forests, swamps, and mountains, local knowledge allowed communities to evade, outmaneuver, and ambush colonial forces, turning environmental familiarity into a strategic advantage. Desert regions required different adaptations. With mobility, water management, and social networks becoming tools of survival and subtle defiance. In coastal regions, control over trade routes, harbors, and local commerce allowed leaders to negotiate and resist economic exploitation, leveraging European dependence on local cooperation to safeguard autonomy wherever possible. Across these varied landscapes, resistance was neither uniform nor isolated. It was a tapestry of tactics, intelligence, and courage tailored to the needs of each community, reflecting an understanding that survival depended on adaptability as much as bravery. Education became another powerful avenue for resistance, particularly in urban and semi-urban areas where colonial influence was strongest. African intellectuals, teachers, and parents cultivated knowledge that combined traditional wisdom with selective engagement with European systems, ensuring that children learned both practical skills and the history of their own people. Secret societies and underground schools fostered critical thinking, cultural pride, and political awareness, preparing a generation to challenge colonial narratives and assert independence when circumstances allowed. Literacy and storytelling were not simply tools of survival. They were instruments of empowerment, sustaining the psychological and cultural resilience of societies that European powers sought to dominate. The legacy of this multifaceted resistance is profound. It demonstrates that Africa's encounter with colonialism was not a one-sided narrative of conquest and subjugation, but a complex interplay of aggression, strategy, endurance, and adaptation. Communities defended themselves with weapons, words, and ideas, proving that sovereignty is defended not only on battlefields, but in the preservation of memory, culture, and knowledge. The bravery of warriors, the ingenuity of leaders, the determination of women, and the quiet persistence of ordinary people collectively shaped a continent that refused to surrender its identity. In weaving together battles like Adwa, guerrilla campaigns, cultural preservation, and education, we see a continent engaged in constant negotiation between survival and autonomy. European ambitions met not silent acquiescence but a vibrant, determined, and strategic resistance that preserved African civilizations despite immense external pressures. These stories remind us that history is defined not only by who holds power but by who resists, who adapts, and who ensures that the flame of identity and sovereignty continues to burn even in the darkest of times. As European powers entrenched themselves across Africa, they quickly realized that conquering land alone was insufficient to maintain lasting control over vast and diverse populations. Military victories and treaties could secure territories temporarily, but the true challenge lay in managing millions of people with long-established social structures, languages, and spiritual traditions. It was here that the strategy of manipulation, deception, and cultural imposition took root, weaving itself into the fabric of colonial governance. Europeans did not merely conquer, they engineered systems designed to fragment societies, weaken resistance, and ensure dependency, using the continent's own diversity against it to solidify their dominance. One of the most pervasive methods was the exploitation of existing ethnic and tribal divisions, where communities had lived alongside each other for centuries, engaging in trade, alliances, and occasional conflict. Colonial administrators redrew maps in ways that heightened rivalries and amplified tensions. Leaders of certain groups were elevated, granted authority over neighboring populations, or installed as intermediaries for European interests, while other communities were marginalized, taxed disproportionately, or stripped of traditional influence. In Nigeria, the British employed an indirect rule system, recognizing some chiefs as legitimate rulers while deliberately undermining others, fostering resentment and dependence. In Rwanda, Belgian colonists institutionalized ethnic distinctions that had previously been fluid, creating identity cards and hierarchies that would have tragic repercussions in the decades to come. These strategies were less about understanding local dynamics than about creating manageable hierarchies that served the imperial agenda. By encouraging suspicion and competition among communities, Europeans weakened the possibility of unified opposition, ensuring that the cost of rebellion remained high and coordination remained difficult. Language, too, became a tool of control. Indigenous tongues, the carriers of oral histories, traditions, and knowledge systems, were systematically devalued or outright banned in schools and official settings. European languages French, English, Portuguese, and Dutch became the medium through which education, law, and governance were communicated, creating a barrier between the colonizers and the colonized. In doing, the colonizers not only asserted dominance but also reshaped the cognitive and social frameworks of entire generations. Children educated in these languages often found themselves alienated from their heritage, while those who resisted colonial schooling risked social exclusion or economic marginalization. This imposition of language extended beyond practical governance. It became a mechanism for cultural dominance, signaling that European knowledge, thought, and values were superior, while African wisdom and traditions were relegated to the margins. Religion was another instrument in the colonizers' arsenal. Missionary activities, often intertwined with colonial administration, sought to replace indigenous spiritual practices with Christianity. Churches and mission schools provided literacy and vocational training, but also conveyed messages of moral and cultural superiority, framing African beliefs as backward or even sinful. Conversion was encouraged through incentives, coercion, or social pressure, and in many cases, traditional religious leaders lost their authority as European clergy gained influence over communities. In regions like the Congo and parts of West Africa, The integration of religious instruction into colonial administration blurred the line between spiritual guidance and political control, embedding European norms deeply into daily life. The goal was not only to reshape belief systems but to cultivate loyalty, obedience, and identification with foreign rulers, creating populations whose allegiance was divided between their traditional structures and the imposed colonial order. European manipulation of governance extended far beyond the appointment of compliant leaders. Entire administrative systems were designed to serve extractive goals rather than local development, with legal codes, taxation, and labor requirements reflecting the priorities of distant capitals rather than the needs of communities. Railways and ports, while touted as progress, were primarily constructed to move resources from inland mines and plantations to coastal markets, facilitating profit extraction rather than connecting towns or promoting internal commerce. Traditional judicial practices were replaced or supplemented with courts that enforced European laws, often interpreting local disputes through alien concepts of property, hierarchy, and crime. Africans were compelled to navigate this hybrid system, where compliance with foreign rules was necessary to survive, and where resistance carried severe consequences. Despite these pressures, African societies found ways to resist and adapt. Secret schools and underground institutions taught indigenous languages and histories alongside colonial curricula, preserving cultural memory and nurturing critical thought. Communities maintained rituals, ceremonies, and oral storytelling traditions, ensuring that values, knowledge, and social cohesion survived even under oppressive governance. Poetry, music, and art became forms of subtle defense, transmitting coded messages of unity, identity, and remembrance that colonial authorities could neither fully monitor nor suppress. Leaders and intellectuals adapted European methods strategically, using education, literacy, and diplomacy to challenge exploitative policies, safeguard their people, and assert claims to autonomy within the constraints imposed by foreign powers. The use of divide and rule strategies, language imposition, religious conversion, and administrative manipulation illustrates a broader pattern in European colonialism. Domination was not achieved solely through force of arms, but through the careful orchestration of social, cultural, and political systems to weaken resistance and entrench dependency. These methods left legacies that extended far beyond independence, shaping national identities, social hierarchies, and internal conflicts across the continent. Borders drawn to facilitate colonial control often disregarded natural, cultural, or linguistic boundaries, and the institutions established to maintain authority frequently persisted, influencing governance and societal structures long after colonial administrators departed. By examining these strategies, it becomes clear that the resilience and creativity of African societies were tested not only on battlefields but within everyday life. Education, culture, and governance. Europeans sought to dominate bodies, lands, and minds, yet Africans preserved identity, memory, and solidarity through adaptive resistance. Cultural preservation and strategic engagement, the imposition of foreign languages, religions, and governance systems was a profound attempt at control, but it ultimately met with ingenuity, resilience, and persistence, proving that power is never absolute when confronted by communities committed to protecting their heritage and autonomy. This story of adaptation, resistance, and survival intertwines seamlessly with the broader narrative of the scramble for Africa, illustrating that even amid exploitation and oppression, the spirit of the continent endured. As we reflect on the sweeping history of the scramble for Africa, it becomes clear that the legacies of colonial borders, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure are not mere remnants of the past but forces that continue to shape the continent today. Nations across Africa still navigate boundaries drawn without regard for communities, languages, or natural geography, often leading to political tensions, disputes, and challenges in governance. Economically, patterns established during colonial times persist, with raw materials extracted for export while local industries struggle to develop, creating cycles of dependency and inequality. Cultural erasure, too, has left deep mark. Indigenous languages were suppressed, traditional knowledge sidelined, and generations taught foreign histories that elevated European figures while obscuring African heroes, innovators, and visionaries. Yet even in the face of these enduring challenges, the spirit of Africa is far from defeated, for the continent is actively reclaiming its past, rewriting its narratives, and asserting its rightful place in history. Across universities, research institutions, and grassroots movements, African scholars are digging through archives, oral histories, and archaeological sites to uncover stories long buried or distorted by colonial narratives. They examine treaties, letters, and artifacts to reconstruct the realities of African societies before and during colonization, challenging the myths imposed from abroad and highlighting the agency, resilience, and sophistication of African civilizations, from the manuscripts of Timbuktu to the stone cities of Great Zimbabwe. Historical research is restoring pride and clarity to African identity, ensuring that future generations understand not only the injustices of the past but also the achievements, innovations, and leadership that colonial powers tried to erase. This work is not merely academic, it is an act of reclamation, asserting that Africa's story is to be told by Africans themselves. Artists and creatives across the continent play a vital role in this reclamation, transforming history into tangible, emotional experiences that reach wide audiences. Filmmakers recreate historical events with nuance and authenticity, restoring voices long silenced and visualizing the courage of African leaders, warriors, and everyday people who resisted oppression. Painters, sculptors, and multimedia artists reclaim symbols that were once co-opted or misrepresented, infusing them with contemporary meaning and cultural pride. Music and literature continue to serve as vehicles for storytelling, blending historical insight with modern expression to educate, inspire, and foster solidarity. Through these creative endeavors, Africa's history becomes a living, dynamic force that hymns not only memory but identity, imagination, and aspiration. Communities, too, are central to this ongoing project of reclamation. From village schools teaching local languages to cultural festivals celebrating indigenous traditions, Africans are actively preserving knowledge and practices that survived despite colonial attempts to suppress them. Diaspora communities connect across continents, sharing oral histories, digital archives, and cultural experiences that link past struggles to present opportunities. Youth movements are particularly instrumental, using technology, social media, and collaborative projects to explore forgotten histories, question inherited narratives, and celebrate African achievements that were previously hidden or ignored. By reclaiming these stories, they assert that Africa was never lost, never passive, and always capable of shaping its destiny despite centuries of external interference. Economic and political reclamation also goes hand in hand with cultural restoration. Leaders, entrepreneurs, and activists are building enterprises that prioritize local needs. Sustainable development and the fair distribution of resources. challenging structures that were designed during colonial times to favor foreign interests. Initiatives in agriculture, technology, and infrastructure aim to reconnect communities, strengthen local economies, and reduce dependency on external systems. Simultaneously, legal and political reforms seek to undo colonial-era distortions, restoring authority to traditional governance structures where appropriate, and creating frameworks that honor both modern institutions and historical realities. These efforts demonstrate that reclaiming Africa's history is inseparable from reclaiming its agency and future. The process of reclaiming Africa's narrative is both restorative and forward-looking. It honors those who resisted, survived, and persevered, from warriors and queens to teachers, poets, and ordinary citizens who preserved knowledge and identity in the shadows of colonial domination. It recognizes the interconnectedness of past and present, showing how historical understanding informs contemporary action, from education and culture to politics and economics. By telling Africa's story on its own terms, scholars, artists, and communities are asserting control over memory, meaning, and direction, ensuring that the continent's past is not merely a record of victimhood but a testament to creativity, resilience, and vision. As viewers and learners, we have the privilege to witness and engage with this transformative work. Understanding the complex legacies of the scramble for Africa helps us see how history shapes the present, how cultures endure, and how communities reclaim what was once taken from them. By amplifying African voices, sharing knowledge, and celebrating the remarkable achievements of people who resisted and rebuilt, we contribute, even in small ways, to a global understanding rooted in truth, justice, and respect. Thank you for watching and exploring this journey through Africa's past with us. If this story inspired you, expanded your knowledge, or offered a new perspective, we invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us in uncovering more untold stories of courage, resilience, and reclamation across the African continent. Every view, share, and engagement helps amplify these voices, ensuring that Africa's narrative is no longer written from the outside but proudly told from